Hello and welcome everyone to today's tutorial on learning C++ from the scratch. In today's tutorial, we are going to talk more about the if condition in C++, where in the previous tutorial, we talked about this if-else structure over here, where we have only two root in our program. If the condition inside this if is true, we are going to trigger the first root in our program in our if-else structure and cancel the second part. Otherwise, if the condition is false, we are going to cancel the first part of our if-else condition over here and trigger the second one. But actually, we can have more than two root in our program, but using a different if condition structure, which we call the if-else-if condition, where we can have more than two root using this structure over here. It could be three root, as you can see in this example over here, or four or five or more, depending on the number of the else if in our program. And of course, only one root will be triggered in this structure as well, depending on the condition. Where, first thing, we are going to check the first condition over here, condition 1. If the condition 1 is true, then we are going to trigger the code inside this first if condition, or the first block of our if-else-if condition structure, and ignore the other or cancel the other part of our if-else-if condition. Otherwise, if the first part is false, then we are going to jump to the second condition that are inside this if-else-if condition over here, which is the second condition, and check if this condition is true or false. If it is true, then we are going to trigger the code inside it and cancel the code on the first part of this if-else structure and the third part of this if-else structure. Otherwise, if the first condition is false and the second condition is false as well, then we are going to trigger the third part over here without any condition. So like the third part or the else part over here don't have any condition and will only be triggered if all the previous if-else-if which have conditions are false. So if all previous conditions are false, then we are going to trigger the else block without any condition. And so, as we said before, the more else if we have, the more root we can create in our program. As you can see over here, we have two else if, one else, and one if, which will create us a total of 4 root in our program. And if we increase the else if, we can have more root in our program. So now, let's jump into an example. Imagine that we want to create a program that asks our user to enter their mark. And of course, a student mark cannot exceed 100, and also cannot be less than 0, where a student cannot get like 105 out of 100 or cannot get like minus 10 out of 100, for example. So the first thing that we need to do is check if the user entered a number bigger than 100 or less than 0. Now, first things first, we are going to ask the user to enter their mark using the cin instruction. And imagine if they entered a number like maybe 55. Our program will test if 55 is bigger than 100 first or not. So, we will use the if-else-if structure condition to check. First things first, we are going to check if the mark is bigger than 100. If the mark that the user entered is bigger than 100, we are going to trigger the first root in our program and display a message telling that they cannot enter a number bigger than 100. Otherwise, we are going to ask the user. If the user didn't enter a mark bigger than 100, we will then next check if they entered a mark less than 0, which is a negative number, in this second step over here. If they do, we are going to trigger the second root, not the first root anymore, and display a message telling them that they cannot enter a negative input. Otherwise, if the user entered a number that doesn't exceed 100 or not less than 0, in this case, we know that our user entered a mark between 0 and 100 only, and anything else like bigger than 100 or less than 0 is not what they entered because we already checked that in the first and the second root. Now, let's jump into the third condition over here where we are going to check if the user entered a mark bigger than 90 or equal, bigger than or equal as you can see over here. If they entered a mark bigger than or equal to 90, which means it will be either 90, 91, 92, 93 into 100. But higher than 100 is impossible because we already checked that as we said in the first root. So if they entered a number bigger than 90, we are going to display a message telling them that they got A. Otherwise, if they didn't get or they didn't enter a number bigger than 90, we are going to check another condition. Okay, it's not bigger than 90. Is it bigger than 80? So here's another condition. If it's bigger than 80, we are going to display a message, you got B. Otherwise, if also they didn't enter a number bigger than 80, we are going to check another condition. Is it bigger than 65? If they get a number bigger than 65, and of course it will be less than 80, because it didn't trigger the root over here, which means it's not higher than 80, then we are going to say that you got C. Finally, if this condition wasn't satisfied, or this, or not, or any of the conditions that we pass on, then we are going to trigger the final root over here. This root doesn't have any condition and will run if none of the previous condition was true, which says sorry, you fail. So if he doesn't get a mark higher than 65 or 80 or 90 and so on, then that's mean that he failed. So let's do it together step by step. First of all, we need to tell the user that we want them to enter their mark. So we are going to use the cout instruction to display a message for them. So we're going to say cout and then display the message we want. Please enter your mark. And now we need a variable to store their input inside it. We can either use integer or float, and I will use integer in this case to make it simple, integer, and name this variable by whatever name we want. I'm going to name it mark. Now we are going to use the cin instruction so that we can allow the user to enter an input inside this mark variable. So I'm going to say cin and then use the mark variable as an storage of our user input. So this is the first step. Secondly, we are going now to start using the else-if structure to see what number did our user enter. Like, is it over 100 or less than 0, or maybe between 90 and 100 and so on. So to use this if condition, we simply need to type if and open a bracket, then open a curly bracket, and then put our condition over here, which said, is the user mark bigger than 100? If so, we are going to display a message, mark cannot be bigger than 100. Otherwise, so this is like our first condition. Now, if it's not bigger than 100, what we need to check next, is it like less than 0? So we need another condition. If we don't need another condition, we can just set else and then open the last root. But in this case, we need another condition. So we are going to write else if and write our second condition. Is our mark less than 0, which means is it negative? In this case, if it is, we are going to display another message telling them that the mark cannot be less than 0. So mark cannot be less than 0. Now we want to have another condition. If it's not bigger than 100 and not less than 0, then we want to check, is it bigger or equal than 90? Because if it is, we want to give them an A as a grade. So else if mark is bigger than or equal to 90, because we want to check if it is 90, 91, 92, so we want to include the 90 with our range. If it is 90 or bigger, we are going to say you got A. Cout, you got A. Congrats. Now, if it's not bigger than 90, we want to check, is it bigger than 80? So we are going to do another condition as well. Else if mark is bigger than 80, or equal of course, we're going to tell them that they got B. cout. Maybe we're going to just copy paste this line over here, copy and paste, and set B instead. And then instead of congrats, we're going to say nice. But if they didn't get 80 or higher, we are then next going to check did they get 65 or higher. Then we're going to put another condition, else if the mark is bigger than 65. And if we want to include the 65, we can set, for example, equal. This will include 65 in our range. We are going to type another cout in this case, telling them that they got C, for example. And then tell them maybe you can do better, for example. You can do better. Finally, if none of the conditions that we wrote was satisfied or true, then we are going to activate a route that doesn't have any condition, which is in this case, it will be a route telling them that they fail. So we are going to say cout, sorry, you fail. And now let's run this program. Let's run this program and try it. Now, if we enter a number bigger than 100, for example, 111, mark cannot be bigger than 100. If we try a negative number, maybe -1, mark cannot be less than 0. If we entered like 95, congrats, you got A. So what if we entered a number between 80 and 90? For example, 88. It would print you got B. Nice. What about if we entered a number between 65 and 80? Maybe 66. You got C, you can do better. And finally, what if our user entered a number between 0 and 65? This should trigger the last route in our program, which says sorry, you fail, as you can see over here. And by the way or the order we write our condition inside the if-else-if condition is important. We're changing the order of our conditions, like maybe putting the order in different place. For example, if we put this over here, for example, we said else, or maybe before this else, and connect it with the else word, and the if structure start with only if we change the order of our condition, our output might change. For example, when we run our program before and write a number bigger than 100, it should tell us that mark cannot be bigger than 100. That was before. But now, what we will see is that it will print you got a congrats. That is because it checked the condition in the same order that we write our conditions. Like it will first check if the mark is less than 0. Then it will check if the mark is bigger than 90. And if any one of them was satisfied, it will run the code inside it and ignore any other code inside this if-else conditions. So we always must put the one who had the priority as a first condition, which in this case we first need to check if the mark is bigger than 100 and less than 0, as we did before. So this one should be checked first, and then after we did make sure that our user didn't enter invalid numbers, we can then check the other condition step by step in the same order. And that's all for today's tutorial. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time.